There is a number you need to keep in your head right now. Not because it tells you what happened last week, but because it tells you everything about what is happening inside the British royal family at this moment, and about why the decision King Charles just made, or rather failed to make, carries consequences that reach far beyond one man, one house, and one deeply fractured family. That number is £150 million. That is the figure placed on the public record not by a tabloid, not by an anonymous source with an agenda, but by Di Davis, the former head of Royal Protection, who recently gave his estimate of the total cost to British taxpayers of protecting Prince Andrew over the course of his lifetime, in today's money. For a man who has not performed a single official royal duty in more than 5 years. Hold that number, because everything that follows flows directly from it. The story that broke quietly in recent weeks, without a press conference, without a formal statement, without any of the ceremonial language the palace uses when it wants to control a narrative, is this. After months of sustained pressure, after King Charles cut his brother's security funding, removed royal artifacts from the walls of his home, and made clear, in every way available to him, short of changing the locks, that Andrew's time at Royal Lodge was finished, the palace acknowledged what insiders had already concluded. Charles had backed down. Andrew is staying. And the words used by a palace source to confirm it were precise and unambiguous. He has won the row. 4 words. They land with a weight entirely out of proportion to their brevity, because what they describe is not simply a property dispute resolved in a disgraced prince's favour. What they describe is a sitting king, the head of one of the most symbolically powerful institutions on earth, unable to move his own brother from a house on his own estate. Before you decide what that means, you need to understand exactly how it happened, because the mechanism matters as much as the outcome. To understand the architecture of this situation, you have to go back to 2003. That year, Prince Andrew signed a 75-year lease with the Crown Estate for Royal Lodge, the 30-room Windsor mansion set on 21 acres that has been his home ever since. The terms of that lease, which only became fully public when a copy was released under pressure, reveal something that takes a moment to fully absorb. Andrew pays 1 peppercorn in annual rent. A peppercorn, the legal minimum, for a property that independent property experts now estimate costs between £4 and £5 million per year just to maintain and secure. He paid £1 million up front and completed £7.5 million in refurbishments when he moved in. That is the entirety of his financial commitment to a residence he has the legal right to occupy until 2078. The Crown Estate, whose profits flow directly to the public treasury, has for more than 2 decades been receiving 1 peppercorn a year from a man living in one of the grandest private estates in Windsor Great Park. And the British public, which was never consulted about this arrangement and never asked whether it considered it acceptable, has been funding the security bill that makes his continued residence there possible. When Andrew lost his taxpayer-funded police protection in 2022, following the sustained reputational collapse caused by his association with Jeffrey Epstein and a civil lawsuit settled out of court, Charles stepped in. Quietly, without public announcement, the king began funding his brother's private security team. A team required specifically because Royal Lodge, unlike properties within Windsor Castle's official security perimeter, sits outside the cordon and demands its own separate protection infrastructure. That arrangement, according to reporting by the Sunday Times, cost nearly $4 million a year. Charles paid it for 2 years. Then, as part of a deliberate campaign to pressure Andrew into vacating Royal Lodge and accepting the more modest Frogmore Cottage, smaller, cheaper to run, and crucially inside the castle's security boundary, the king stopped. he did not renew the contract. The logic was straightforward. Remove the subsidy. Let the full financial weight of a £5 million annual upkeep fall on a man whose only declared income is a £20,000 naval pension, and the outcome would follow naturally. It did not follow naturally. Andrew found money from somewhere. Exactly where remains, remarkably, undisclosed. Earlier reports pointed to a commercial arrangement with a Dutch startup firm, a deal built on the network of contacts Andrew accumulated during his years as the United Kingdom's trade envoy. Other accounts have noted his past financial dealings with Gulf states and interests in China, connections that, in any other context, would attract serious and sustained public scrutiny. But Andrew is no longer a working member of the royal family, and that is precisely the gap he is exploiting. He retains a lease signed when he was still a senior royal. He retains a residence secured under protections granted to a man whose public standing bore no resemblance to what it is today. And he retains, in law, the right to stay there, regardless of what the institution that once granted him those protections now thinks of him. This is where the story becomes something larger than one family's internal dispute. There are people inside the palace who will tell you, carefully and with appropriate deniability, that patience is the strategy. That Charles, unable to act directly, has decided to wait. The property is deteriorating. Visitors describe crumbling stonework and peeling paint. The internal decor has not been updated since the Queen Mother lived there in the 1950s. The Crown Estate, which owns the building, is now itself growing publicly frustrated over Andrew's failure to maintain the exterior. And a formal dispute has emerged over who bears legal responsibility for repairs that may run into the hundreds of thousands. And in 2028, the lease comes up for review. At that point, the Crown Estate will have grounds to scrutinise Andrew's compliance with maintenance obligations. Grounds, potentially, to revisit the terms entirely. Grounds that Charles does not currently possess and cannot manufacture. That, in the palace's framing, is the plan. Time, disrepair, a legal process that does not require a king to confront his brother directly and lose again. The question that serious analysts are now asking is whether that framing reflects a genuine strategy, or whether it reflects something more uncomfortable, an institution that has discovered the hard outer edge of its own authority and chosen to describe that edge as a deliberate choice rather than a boundary it ran into unexpectedly. Because the £150 million figure does not exist in isolation. It sits alongside the Peppercorn rent. It sits alongside the $4 million annual security bill that Charles quietly absorbed for 2 years. It sits alongside the £1 million annual allowance, also cut, that had kept Andrew financially functional throughout his years of disgrace. Follow that money through 2 decades of quiet subsidy, royal protection, discounted leases, and private arrangements made far from public view. What emerges is a portrait of an institution that spent an extraordinary amount of resource, public and private, maintaining a man it publicly disowned, and that now finds, having finally stopped paying, that it cannot make him leave. Prince Andrew spent 20 years accumulating the legal, financial, and structural protections of royal privilege. He spent a fraction of that time dismantling his public reputation. And the asymmetry between those 2 timelines is the engine of everything that has happened since. He does not need the palace's goodwill. He has the lease. He does not need the king's money. He has found other sources that the palace cannot fully trace and cannot publicly question without drawing attention to the foreign relationships that funded his years as trade envoy. He does not need public rehabilitation. He has, it appears, concluded that it will never come, and that the house is worth more than the effort of pursuing it. That staying, enduring, outlasting the pressure is the only viable strategy available to him, and that it is working. There is a version of this story that Charles's advisors would prefer the world to consider. A king acting with strategic patience, a timeline unfolding as planned. A 2028 review waiting in the institutional calendar like a quiet correction already in motion. That version requires you to believe that Charles always intended to wait 6 years, that cutting the security funding was a long game from the beginning, not a direct move that failed. That a palace source confirming Andrew had won the row was a deliberate misdirection rather than an admission of exactly what it sounded like. Serious royal observers, watching the gap between institutional narrative and institutional reality, are not fully persuaded. What is not in dispute is the outcome as it stands today. Andrew remains at Royal Lodge. The king's security funding is gone, replaced by private money of unclear origin. The royal artifacts have been removed from the walls. The house is deteriorating around its occupant. And the public, when it turns its attention to this story, is left with an image that the monarchy's communications team cannot easily reframe. A man who cost British taxpayers an estimated £150 million over his lifetime, who pays a peppercorn in annual rent for a mansion that costs £5 million a year to run, and who could not, for all the tools at the Crown's disposal, be moved. Whether 2028 changes that calculation, or whether Andrew outlasts the review process as he has outlasted every other mechanism deployed against him, is the question the palace has bought itself time to defer. But time in royal affairs has a way of compressing without warning, and what the monarchy is now navigating, quietly, without press statements, without any of the language it reaches for when it wants to project control, is the realization that the instruments of royal authority are not what they once appeared to be. That a 75-year lease, signed in 2003 for a peppercorn, is more durable than a king's displeasure. That a man with no income, no titles, no public role, and no reputation left to protect is, in certain specific and important ways, freer than the institution trying to move him. A man sitting in a house the Crown cannot reclaim, surrounded by crumbling stonework and empty shelves where the royal artifacts used to be. Watching the institution wait for him to run out of money or will. That is not a man who has been defeated. That is a man who has decided that endurance is its own form of power. The monarchy built that man. It granted him the lease. It paid the security bills. It funded the allowance. It extended, year after year, the quiet protections that made Royal Lodge possible. And now it is discovering, at considerable cost and with uncomfortable visibility, that the structures it built around him are holding, just not in the direction it intended. The house still stands. Andrew is still in it. And the institution that made him is left to reckon with the full weight of what £150 million, one peppercorn of rent and a 75-year lease actually built.